Recording. Alrighty. Well, good evening, everyone. Nice to see you. Nice to be with you this evening. As I said, my name is Rabbi Morris Panitz, and I'm one of the rabbis at IKAR, which is a spiritual community up in Los Angeles. And I'm really just so thrilled to be joining you all this evening and filling in for Rabbi Adam for this class, which sounds like really a wonderful space that you all have created together, learning foundational texts. And as I said before, Rabbi Adam and I have known each other for, let me think, maybe eight or 9 years or so. I met him first when I was a student at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, and he was on faculty there. And when I became a rabbi, when I graduated from rabbinical school, I had the great privilege of working alongside Rabbi Adam at AJU, primarily in the Miller Intro to Judaism program, in which we worked together. And so some of the faces here are familiar, and it's really delightful to be with you all again this evening. Rabbi Adam and I ran a class together called Intro 2.0. It had various subtitles to that over the years, but we did some really good learning together, some important texts that we studied in that class. And it's just an honor to be with you all again. When Rabbi Adam told me the theme of this class, right off the bat, a couple of texts came to mind. But then I thought, let me do my due diligence. Let me go through my files, look through old classes that I've taught, look through texts that I've pulled out as sacred texts and see what there is. And one of the great pleasures of that exercise was seeing how many of my foundational texts are texts that I learned either from Adam or with Rabbi Adam, or were texts that we had actually taught together to some of you here. And so much do I owe to my teachers and from my teachers, and Rabbi Adam is one of my teachers and one of my friends. And it was sweet to go on sort of a journey back through some of the learning that the two of us had done together. And then when I spoke to him earlier today, I said, Rabbi Adam, I'm really excited because I think I have a text that perhaps you haven't seen. And that really, that piqued his interest. And so the jury's out. I haven't sent him the source sheet yet, so, I'll send it to him afterwards. But my hope is that this is a text perhaps that the majority of you, if not all of you, haven't seen. And it's a text that I think really opens up a lot of really interesting questions about one of the most foundational and important and sacred topics there is, which is death and dying. So before I launch into the text, given what I just shared about the theme that we'll be covering tonight, I want to just offer a few introductory remarks. I always tell my students, be wary of the rabbinic preamble. It's always quite lengthy. I am very aware that as the sun sets this evening, in the Jewish calendar, the sun is setting on Yom HaShoah, on today, which has been the day of Holocaust remembrance. And so I'm not sure to what degree you all have been able to engage with that sacred act of memory and mourning this year on this day or on some days surrounding this moment in the calendar. But I want to admit that I'm coming to you all very much in the space of having just been with students at a Yom HaShoah tekes, a ceremony, and have been thinking a lot and feeling a lot around the content of today on the Jewish calendar. And to that point, I'd like to dedicate our learning tonight to my maternal grandparents, Sophie and Morris Sulzer, for who I'm named and for who my daughter is named, both of whom escaped the Lodz ghetto in Poland just days before the ghetto was sealed and hundreds of thousands of Jews were shipped to concentration camps. And I'm wondering, given both where we are in the calendar and the fact that I'm hoping to have, a relatively emotional and vulnerable conversation around death and dying, if anyone here would like to write into the chat the name or names of loved ones, whether Holocaust survivors, whether they perished in the Holocaust, or just folks who you're sitting with in your hearts. If you'd like to dedicate this learning to anyone, I encourage you to put the name of those loved ones into the chat and perhaps how it is that you're connected to that person. And while you're doing it, I'll just say that I'm not sure if you're familiar with this practice before, but our tradition teaches that one of the ways that we can connect with deceased loved ones, ways that we can feel their soul reverberating in our world, is to learn in their merits, in their honor, or in their memory. And so sharing the name of loved ones is a beautiful way to honor that tradition and to try to find ways to connect with those who are no longer here with us in body. Thank you, Michelle. May her memory be a blessing. Thank you, Alex and Megan. May Arnold's memory be for a blessing. Thank you, Mimi. May Joseph's memory be for a blessing. Zichrono livracha. Thank you, Christina, Flora, and Catalina. May Pierre's memory be for a blessing. All right, feel free to add additional loved ones into the chat as their names rise to the surface of your memory and heart. I'm going to share the text by screen, if that's okay. And I'm going to walk us through this text, paragraph by paragraph. This text comes from Deuteronomy Rabbah, which is a collection of midrash, of rabbinic commentary on the fifth book of the Torah, on Deuteronomy, or Devarim in Hebrew. And the style of that collection of midrash is to typically take verses from the Torah and to expand them, explicate them, to weave additional stories and commentary around the plain meaning of the Torah. And so our text is an exploratory imagining around Moses's death, right? If you recall from the end of Deuteronomy, the whole 5 books of Moses concludes not in the land of Israel, but on the other side of the Jordan, right? With Moses denied entry into the promised land, with Moses's death. And it's in a sense a literal cliffhanger, right? We know in the rest of the Bible, the people of Israel will cross into Israel, but the Torah itself ends with the people still in the wilderness and Moses dying in the final chapters of the Torah. The Torah doesn't give us a whole lot of detail around what exactly happened in the moment or moments surrounding Moses' death. And so that's one of the functions of Midrash, is to weave new stories around the sparse information that's given in the Torah itself. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. I'll make it a little bit bigger if I can. Just give me a thumbs up that you see the text. Okay, excellent. All right, so folks, please put chats or comments, questions or comments into the chat. And I very much hope and would love for this to be participatory. And so I'm going to pause throughout and also solicit your interpretations and comments and questions, throughout our learning together. All right, here we go. The time of Moses came to an end. A divine voice went forth saying, "The end, your death draws near." Now let me pause for a moment to acknowledge some of us will know when our time is coming, and others won't. And how different that can make the whole experience around death and dying. This text, at its core, I believe, represents the rabbis imagining and articulating an ideal death. An ideal death. What does the most beautiful death look like, feel like, sound like, according to the rabbis? And not only is it an ideal death, but think about who our protagonist is here. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, right? So we have the ideal circumstances of death, the ideal way to transition being represented here in the greatest of leaders and prophets and teachers that our tradition has ever known, right? But just consider this opening line, right? Moses is told by the divine voice itself, by the bat kol itself, that his death is imminent. Moses responded to God, "Master of the universe, Ribono shel Olam, remember the day when you were revealed to me in the bush, and you said to me, 'Go, I shall send you to Pharaoh to bring forth my people, the children of Israel, from Egypt.' Remember the day when I stood upon Mount Sinai 40 days and 40 nights. Please do not hand me over into the power of the angel of death." A divine voice answered, "Do not be afraid. I myself shall attend to you and to your burial." Take a moment and maybe just, read that paragraph again to yourself. Internalize it. So I'd love to hear what's going on here. What do you imagine Moses is experiencing in this moment that leads him to respond to God the way that he does? Let's take a couple answers. Feel free to just unmute yourself and offer your answer.
Does he still think he has more work to do, or that God should be able to use him some more? And, even though he knows he's not supposed to go into Israel, but.
Good. Alice, I think that's definitely a possibility, right? It certainly seems like Moses is not ready for his life's work to be completed here on earth, right? He's a servant, right? He's a servant of God. He wants another mission, right?
Yeah.
And perhaps that's why he's reminding God of some of the great missions, right? He's been sent on. Free your people from Egypt, right? Give me revelation at Sinai that I can transmit it to the people, right? Give me another chapter, God. Tom and Michelle both wrote fear into the chat, which I think I'm sensing as well, but I'm wondering if one of you could give some additional language to that. Sure. We can also go to Diane and then Alan.
Oh, my feeling is just like I think I would feel is, Moses did all this, the regret of not being able to see Israel still, and always, all along the way, he has never hesitated to be able to question God and ask, and why not one more time to see?
I love that, Diane. I love that you're picking up also on right, an element of intimacy, of relationship that exists between Moses and God. They have the kind of relationship where Moses can push back a little bit, right? God says, it's time to go. And Moses says, it's time to argue, right? You have to appreciate that, because that's been an element of their partnership, right? For 40 plus years, right? And so I love that you're reading the pushback to some degree as the intimacy of their relationship. Alan.
I do like that. I was thinking, I wonder if he might be afraid of something like being out of connection with God, or not being, or something like losing control or something, because the examples from his life that he mentions are when he was in touch with God or doing something that God had told him to do, and then he seems to maybe express some fear about like being kind of handed over to the angel of death, which is something different from God. And so it's like a fear of not being under God's control anymore, or being like kind of taken over by somebody else. But then God reassures him that it's not going to be like that.
I wanted to put the text back on the screen so everyone can see really just how careful and insightful of a read that is, Alan, right? So part of the fear that Moses expresses is about being turned over, handed over to the power of the angel of death. Now, one possibility is to read that, as a euphemism, right? I don't want to die. But another possibility is to read it, I think, as you did, Alan, which is a fear of a rupture in Moses's relationship with God, right? Moses has had a direct line to God for all of these years, right? God has looked out for him and vice versa. And he's scared that now this other divine being, the angel of death, is gonna step in and break the relationship in some way, right? I want to also say, and I think maybe this was part of what was shared in the chat, right? I hope that to some degree, what Moses is doing here feels actually profoundly relatable, right? Very human, I want to say, right? Despite Moses being Moses, do we not recognize, right, this fear of death? Right? Whether that's a fear of our story coming to a close, or that's a fear of a discontinuation of relationships that are dear and precious to us, or a fear of the unknown of what comes next, right? Or a fear, even angel of death, of the actual experience of death and dying, right? And whatever suffering perhaps might accompany that. And I think Moses is expressing something very relatable to the human experience. And so again, I want to return you to the notion that, yes, this is a text about the ideal death and the ideal human. But the reason I feel that this is such a foundational text for me in my life, and I hope that you'll feel perhaps similarly, is because I think it's a text that really speaks to the human condition in a very profound way. Right? And so Moses is expressing what many of us might be feeling in this moment. I'll add just one more point. Think about Moses's biography and what Moses might associate the angel of death with. Right? The last time the angel of death, the Malach HaMavet, is mentioned is the 10th plague in Egypt. Makat Bechorot, the death of the firstborn. Right? Of course, Moses is spared by that, but the death of the firstborn, many rabbis, commentators believe, is the divine response to Pharaoh's decree to kill baby boys in Egypt, of which Moses was almost the victim of that decree, if not saved from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter. And so one could easily imagine, if we're playing Moses's psychologist for a moment, one could easily imagine that Moshe has a complex relationship with the angel of death and has associations with this divine figure that would produce a lot of fear. I'm sorry that I'm forgetting your name, but I see that you just unmuted.
Well,
Yes, would you like to share anything?
I would like to share the fact, I mean, it's obvious to everyone that God was right there listening and understood what Moses was going through with the news that your end is near, and said to Moses, "Do not be afraid. I myself shall attend to you and to your burial." God knows Moses as well as Moses knows God. And so the two of them were actually having a conversation. And he answered the question that Moses, well, the plea of Moses, "I will be with you. Don't be afraid."
Yes. Tell me your name again, please.
Rosalie Holub.
Rosalie, isn't it gorgeous? Isn't it gorgeous? You know, God's response, first of all, the fact that they have this kind of relationship where they speak this way is remarkable. Right? But in addition, right, God's response isn't, "Okay, Moses, you can be spared the fate that all humans, that all created beings experience," right? God doesn't bend the rules of nature in response. What God senses is that behind Moses's plea for more time, and this goes back to I think what both Diane and Alan said, right, is this sense of Moses being scared of being alone or of having some rupture in the relationship here. And so God is responding to that fear, to that anxiety. Don't be afraid. I will be with you. I will attend to your burial. Right? Might the angel of death still be there? Maybe, maybe not, but God will be there as well.
It seems to me that this is the way that God comforts Moses in the very scenes that he's like recalling too, where he's just like, well, who am I that I should go to Egypt and like say this? And God's like, don't worry, I'm going to be there with you. Right.
That's right.
That same message.
That's beautiful, Laura. That's beautiful. And maybe that's one of the defining features of their relationship, right? Is God's continual reassurance, I will be with you, right? And that just triggers for me at the burning bush when Moses, in a sense, meets God for the first time. And Moses says, well, who are you? Right? What's your name? And God's answer is, Ehiyeh Asher Ehiyeh. I will be that which I will be, right? Which I think is another way of saying, I will be for you who you need to be throughout the evolutions of your life and even in death. All right, for the sake of time, now I understand why Rabbi Adam loves learning with you all so much. I'm going to keep us moving on this source sheet. I just want to point out here, I put in gray boxes questions that I think help extend this text from the space of trying to understand the text in its own right, in its own world, to questions that perhaps make this a little bit more personal. I think that this text is a wonderful way into some of the very hard and commonly avoided conversations around our own mortality or the mortality of our loved ones. And I, in fact, have used this text in the past to help people have and families have the hard conversations that are actually so infused with love when they happen intentionally and honestly and openly. So we're not going to pose these questions to each other tonight, but I will, be sure to send Rabbi Adam the source sheet to also share with you all so that, you can spend time with these at a different. All right. With your permission, I'm going to scroll down. At that time, Moses stood and purified himself like one of the angels. The Holy One descended from the highest heavens, fetched the soul of Moses, and 3 ministering angels, Malachei Hasharet, accompanied God, Michael, Gabriel, and Zagzagel. Anyone looking for a good baby name? Zagzagel. I haven't heard that one recently. Michael laid out the bier for Moses, and Gabriel spread a linen cloth at its head. Zagzagel stood at its foot with Michael on one side and Gabriel on the other side. God said to Moses, "Moses, shut your eyes." And he closed his eyes. He said, "Place your hand upon your chest." And he placed his hand on his chest. He said, "Put your feet close together." And he put his feet close together. Take a moment to read this over to yourself. If you can, try to picture the scene to whatever degree you can. So I want to start with the choreography of this moment, right? God and 3 angels, and very specific embodied instructions on how to prepare, on how to begin the transition. I'm curious to hear both why you think God brought 3 angels and why you think God is giving Moses the instructions that God is giving in this scene. Let's start there. Why 3 angels and why these instructions? All right, Aviva Leah, I'm gonna, if I can, put you on the spot because I think you've offered something quite insightful in the chat. Would you be willing to say more what you mean when you say Chevra Kadisha?
Yeah. I mean, it's very reminiscent of the rituals around burial, and it's a group of people. It's there's I mean, most of what I've learned from you about Hefer Kadisha. So, there's washing involved. There's a lot of choreography involved, and with the linen cloth, and it's just I really don't know if one is based on the other, but it just feels very reminiscent of that entire process.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Did anyone else make that connection? Just maybe show me with a nod or a... So let me just take a step back. the Chevra Kadisha, sometimes referred to as a burial society or a holy fellowship, is a group of individuals in a Jewish community that attends to the body and soul of the deceased in the time between death and burial. So typically a Chevra Kadisha plays two roles. The first is called Shmirah, which is a ritual guarding of body and soul, an accompaniment of the deceased so that they're never alone from the moment of death until the moment of burial. And then the second primary function of a Chevra Kadisha is what's called tahara, like the Hebrew word tahor, pure, tahara meaning purification, which Viva Leah was describing, which has to do with the really the washing, purifying, and dressing of the body in plain white linen shrouds as a way of preparing the body for burial. And the work of the Chevra Kadisha is very choreographed, for lack of a better word, right? That the body is attended to sort of one side at a time, one body part at a time, right? The body is washed from head to toe and with intentionality as water is spread over each limb, right? The body is dressed one article of clothing at a time. And so what's interesting about this moment is Moses doesn't seem to have died yet, but it does. I think you're spot on, Aviva Leah. It does seem and feel like his body is being prepared for burial in the way that would typically happen in the time between death and burial. Diane, please.
I almost get the sense it's almost like a guided meditation that God is doing with Moses, that we know that he's not dead yet, and yet even just for me, I don't know about others, just reading it, I got a sense of calm going through it, as a way to kind of help Moses. That was just the sense I got.
Yeah, and I saw others nodding as you were saying that. I don't know how many of you have had the experience of accompanying a loved one in the moments of transition. And for those of you who have had that experience, what degree of consciousness the person exhibited in their transition. As a rabbi, as a congregational rabbi, I've been by the side of folks who are in this moment, sort of this liminal moment, right, between life and death. And what I have found is that much of the work of loved ones helping people through this transition is to try to help them release any fear that they might have. Right? Moses expressed fear in the first paragraph that we read. And like a guided meditation, like a body scan, right? Like giving a hug to a child to help them calm down, right? I think that God and the angels are helping Moses release, right? Helping him release his attachment to this plane and helping him release whatever fear he might have, which is living in his body in addition to his mind, heart, and soul. Daryl.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
That was the sense that I got that Hashem wanted to, of course, keep his word. I will be the one to do this, and then he brought in others because he originally said angel of death, and Moses was like, well, but so he brought in Michael and Gabriel, who would be known to him and maybe placate him or put him at ease in a way. So those were the two things that immediately struck me.
I love that, Daryl. What a great read. I hadn't noticed that before. That instead of the angel which provokes fear for Moses, God brings angels of reassurance, angels of comfort, angels of safety, right, to help literally, or not literally and figuratively, sort of enwrap Moses in a web of care. Beautiful observation. Sharon.
It seems to me that God is helping Moses's body to sleep, quote, until his soul is bare for him to then take care of too. But also they prepare him in a way where it's dignified for him to be dying. And a lot of people sleep with their hand over their heart anyway. And the whole thing sounds like a very peaceful come to rest and don't be afraid. Something's going to happen to you. I was thinking Moses is so much about life. And even if he's experienced a great deal of death in his life, he now has to go into the land of death from being alive, so alive. And also, I was saying before, Moses can argue with God all he wants, but nobody can argue with death.
Right.
So if death's sort of in the background, you're not arguing with him, you're accepting the process that's involved.
Yeah.
Those are my thoughts. And I've experienced close to seeing someone die, and it's horrific as far as I'm concerned. You don't know what you can do to help. But the idea that somebody could simply go to sleep with their loved ones around them is quite beautiful.
Yeah.
I wish. Yeah.
Sharon, I think another in yet this is yet another example of how this text is functioning as a sort of an ideal imagining of the experience of death, right? But I think it's and there's so much that you all don't need me to say this, but there's so much that's out of our control when it comes to the realm of death and when it approaches us unexpectedly and when we come close to it. And despite there being so much out of control, I think that this text is also trying to empower us to the degree possible to imitate God, as we are instructed to do in so many other places in our tradition. Just as God clothes the naked, so shall we clothe the naked. Just as God feeds the hungry, so too should we feed the hungry. By the way, in that very text, it says, just as God buries the dead, so too do we bury the dead. And this is Moses is the example that's given in that famous midrash. And I think it's not just the God role here that we are aspiring to imitate, but it's the role of the angels as well. And so, some angels belong exclusively to the divine realm, and some angels are on this Zoom meeting right now. I fully believe that, right? We all have an angelic capacity. And so to be by the side of a loved one, as Michael, Gabriel, and Zagzagel are, in a reassuring and loving manner, is something we can strive to offer when we find ourselves in this position. Hal.
I tend to view the text that we've gone over so far and the conversation, the beginning conversation between God and Moses as being all very integrated. I position it in the context of Devarim, of the whole book. And I'm recalling a Devar Torah that one of our congregants gave many years ago, in which he said that Devarim was much like a parent who's seeing his child off to college. And I think a lot of us have experienced this, where at the very last moment, we want to make sure that that child got it, that child got all of the messages that we wanted to convey. obviously it's a little late in the game to have that, but we all go through that emotion, or at least I did. I know that, and I think a lot of us have. And in that context, I think maybe when Moses was concerned that the power, which is a key word, I think, in the text, was given to the angel of death, I think maybe one thing that was going through his mind is, what kind of a legacy is this? What kind of an end am I going to have? Is it going to be so incongruous that I won't be accorded any respect at all? That I've done all this work and I've accomplished all these, and now it's just over. It's just suddenly over. And that's where I see God's response as being very, very integrated to the question, saying, Moses, don't worry. No one else is going to be accorded this honor that I am personally going to oversee this process. And then you get into the next page that you offered, and it's just a magnificent treatment that's being accorded Moses that I think is in concert with what he had accomplished.
Hal, I want you to hold on to that thought, because I think we're going to circle back to it in the concluding sentences of this midrash. So I think you're seeing where the text has taken us, and you're also seeing where we're going to go. So that's a beautiful comment. Alex and Megan, it's a good question where the tradition comes from having grieving participants participate in the shoveling of the dirt. I don't think it comes from this midrash, but I like the link that you're drawing, right? That there's it's sort of a invitation to participate in the burial and the caring of our loved ones, right, as a way of attending to them and giving them. I mean, the language our tradition uses for that moment is chesed shel emet, right? The highest form of love and kindness we can give someone is to help bury them, right? And the tradition positions it that way is because it's a love that cannot be returned, right? It's not reciprocal, and so that's a high form of love. Okay, I'm mindful of the clock, so I'm going to take us back in. All wonderful insights. Okay, hopefully you see the screen again. All right. Listen to where we go next. Then God called out to the soul, the neshama, within his body, saying, my daughter, I allocated you 120 years to be in the body of Moses. Now your time for departure has arrived. Come out, do not delay. I want to just pause to point out, to the comment earlier that God is preparing Moses' body, and now, before the care of the soul can happen. The language here, notice how in the beginning, right, a divine voice went forth and addresses Moses, and Moses integrated body and soul, right, is responding to God. And now, after this purification ritual, this Chevra Kadisha-like experience, this calming of body, God addresses the soul. And I understand this as maybe this is really that liminal moment where perhaps the individual has lost consciousness, but they're still with us, but they seem to be 1 foot in the living and 1 foot beyond. And I think that that's sort of the moment that the Midrash is trying to capture right here. And so the conversation, as you see, is going to be between God and Moses' soul, right? Happening perhaps in some plane in between what we know and what's to come. And also, again, just the beauty of the language, my daughter, the intimacy of that language. Now your time for departure has arrived. The soul responded, Master of the universe, I know that you are the God over all spirits and life forces. You created me, informed me, and placed me in the body of Moses for 120 years. Is there a body in the universe that is purer than the body of Moses? I love him and do not wish to depart from him. God answered, soul, come out without delay, and I will cause you to ascend to the highest heaven, and I will install you under the throne of glory next to the angels, next to the Kruvim and Seraphim. I love the fact that Moses, of all people, right? Moses is the one who saw God. Right? He's from behind, he saw God. Right? The intimacy of Moses and God's relationship is unlike any other human divine relationship, as our tradition illustrates. Moses, of all people, would know what it's like to be unified with God in soul and in spirit. And yet, what is the soul's hesitation? I don't want to leave this body. I don't want to leave this beautiful person who I've been partnered with for 120 years, right? Whose hands and heart and stuttering speech took me to places I could have only dreamed of going. Again, the humanity of this moment. I know, the soul says, that I'm going to get to go up to the heavens and be closer to you, God, but I'm still reticent to leave this plane of existence. Curious to hear a reaction or two to this paragraph. Why daughter? Why daughter? Any thoughts on that? Ellen, you just need to unmute yourself, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, it's kind of funny because it's almost like God is missing the point.
Say more.
Well, the soul doesn't want to depart from the body of Moses. And God says, I'm going to put you into the structure of the throne of heaven.
Yeah.
But that's not what the soul desires.
Right.
It's not going to induce the soul to be unafraid or to accept the separation of its separation from Moses. And yet God is supposed to be omniscient. How could God not understand this? That's the odd reaction.
Well, you know, and to Tom's point in the chat as well, taken together, right? The conceit of the text, which I think is the conceit of human life, is that death is inescapable. Death is inevitable.
Yeah.
No amount of bargaining or pleading or praying or direct communication with God can reverse the inevitability of death. And God knows that. And maybe on some level, Moses and Moses' soul knows that, right? But even if we all know that, it doesn't necessarily stop us from crying out, right, to have something that we know is impossible. But that doesn't compel God to grant the impossible. Right? God has to find a way to say no with all the love that God can muster, which I happen to think is an infinite amount of love. Sharon, Alex, Megan, and Alice.
Okay, this is going to be my not really feminist moment, but anyway, or English moment. aren't all souls female? And also it has to do with grammar because God's male, souls are female, and it's an insistence upon the binary placement of beings that we're God's daughters in the sense that we're souls. Other religions have this kind of thing going too, but I believe there's a long history that could be discussed for hours about this, but I just find it super interesting.
You're right. There's hours of conversation. My 10-second response to that will be, I think there is something grammatical going on. Nishama is a feminine noun. So BT, my daughter, is perhaps a reference to the feminine noun here. I would resist the sort of conclusive notion that God is male and the soul is female, because Jewish texts portray the gender of God and souls differently in different texts, right? So I wouldn't say that sort of definitively. In the case of this text, perhaps it's some combination of the grammatical explanation and I think the rabbis are trying to highlight the love and the intimacy, and saying my daughter, I think, is the rabbi's way of conveying. Alex and Megan.
I just think it's really interesting and beautiful that the soul is saying what body is more pure than Moses, when, as you said, Moses was a stutterer. Moses makes mistakes throughout the Torah. And so it kind of speaks to the beauty of all life, despite all of its imperfections. Like, that's what make them beautiful.
Yeah. And listen, may we live in a world in which all souls feel at home in the bodies that they're placed in. We know that that's not the case for many individuals, and that it can be a lifetime of work to feel that alignment. And it is, I think, beautiful and aspirational and inspiring, right? That Moses' soul loved the body that in-housed it, as you said, Alex, despite whatever limitations that body might have placed on the soul, or maybe because of. Okay? Alice.
Actually, that's what I think really struck me, was that we had the soul, this entity, and it was placed in this body, and it liked the way it was able to manifest itself, but that now it's coming out. And, I don't necessarily believe in souls being placed around, but yet you do see people and you think, oh my goodness, they remind me of, a child is born and they say, oh, they remind me of this great grandmother or something like that. And, but thinking of the soul as such a separate entity, and then it just happens to be, and what you just said about it gets placed in a body, and maybe it's a body and maybe it's not a good fit, or in the body that it's placed, in the reality that body is existing, it can't be happy. Yeah, that I just found that I hadn't thought of it that way before, the individuality.
There's certainly a rabbinic theology here, which is being expressed in this text, in which right, souls begin their journey in the bond of life, bitzor hachayim, as we say in the El Maleh prayer at funerals and Yisker and so forth, right, are sent to this world, right, in the bodies of very least human beings, and then are returned to the tzor hachayim, to the bond of life. And then, depending on how mystical your theology is, they either then get returned and returned and returned, or they then, hang out in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden above, right? That's for a different class. And if I'm not mistaken, you all had a wonderful rabbi for many, many years who I suspect taught on that topic once or twice. So I won't venture to go there. But yes, and I want to just uplift Tom's comment in the chat and say amen to it out loud. May we live in a world where bodies may freely adapt to meet their soul's needs. A beautiful prayer. Amen. Okay, let me close the text with the final paragraph. Okay, at that time, the Holy One, blessed be he, kissed Moses and took his soul while kissing his mouth. Then God wept, saying, there shall never again arise a prophet like Moses in Israel. Hal, this is to your point earlier, right? That God's eulogy, right? God's eulogy is, Lo kam navi od b'Yisrael k'Moshe. There shall never arise a prophet like Moses in Israel. I'm not going to read all the way through the rest, but I just want you to see, right? It sort of feels like a cosmic funeral then happens for Moses, right? God eulogizes, the heavens eulogize, earth weeps and eulogizes. Joshua was searching for his teacher and couldn't find him and weeps. The angels eulogize. All of Israel, and then I'll just read the last two lines, right? And these and those said, Elu ve'elu hayo omrim, and this I think you'll recognize, the memory of the righteous shall be for a blessing. Zecher tzadik livracha, right? Zecher livracha, zichrono livracha, zichrona livracha, what we traditionally say. May it be God's will. Baruch Adonai leolam amen. Amen. Blessed be the Lord forever. Amen. What I really want to highlight from that last section, and this is another reason that for me this is a foundational text, is that God weeps. God weeps. God grieves. This is not the God of Rambam, of Maimonides, who is emotionless, who doesn't change, and who doesn't have feelings. This is the God of the rabbis of Midrash, right? Who shares in our sorrow, who loves us so dearly that God misses us once we've passed, which is an extraordinary comment given the fact that our souls will return to God, right? But that God grieves the uniqueness of this union of body and soul. And that's certainly what God is expressing to Moses in this final moment. And so, friends, I will conclude by saying the assignment, as I understood it from Rabbi Adam, was to share a foundational text, to teach it, and to try to convey why it's foundational, at least for me. And so I hope what you have gleaned from this text, I hope that what I say now isn't anything new, but that it sort of came across over the last hour. But just to put a fine point on it, a couple reasons that I find this text to be so meaningful and foundational for me in my life. Number one, the text dares go to a moment in all of our lives that we as a society tend to shrink away from. And the text is willing in courageous fashion to explore that moment. Number two, despite the fact that it's an ideal death built around an ideal human, what we find is something so relatable. Soul resistance, Aviva Leah. I think that's what you put into the chat. Soul resistance, how real that is. A fear of going, a bargaining with God or with loved ones about wanting to stay longer, and the ways in which God, the angels, and those of us who strive to walk in the ways of God and the angels can help people navigate and experience this moment with grace, with love, with acceptance, and with the courage we need or our loved ones need to make that journey. And last, third, is that it presents God in the kind of loving capacity that is the God that I choose to believe in. A God who unconditionally loves us, and part of that love is expressed by sharing in our sorrow and weeping when we're gone. So friends, I thank you for the privilege of learning with you this evening. Those of you who see Rabbi Adam on a daily or weekly basis, if you have a hugging relationship with him, please give him a hug for me. If you have a handshake relationship with him, I'll take that too. You can, if you have a relationship with Gracie that allows you to pick her up, you can do that as well. And I hope that your learning in this series really continues to be inspiring and meaningful, and that you learn from each other and you continue to learn from our great, great teacher, rabbi, and friend, Rabbi Adam Greenwald. All right, I'll stick around for a few minutes just to keep the conversation going for anyone who wants to stick around. And thank you for the opportunity.